¿Estamos en vivo?
Así es. Están entrando ya los participantes.
Vamos a dar 2 minutitos para que terminen de entrar los participantes.
Muy bien. Buenos días, buenas
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on the place where you're listening to us. It is a pleasure to start this webinar of the Environmental Secretariat of the Americas Free Trade Agreement, and welcome you on behalf of the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, Mexico, United States, and Canada, between Dominican Republic, CAFTA, the Secretariat of Environmental Compliance for Promotion, Trade, and the Secretariat of the Environmental Legislation for Panama, United States, and the Secretariat for Environmental Legislation for Commercial Trade between Colombia and the United States. The secretariats have been developing a regional effort to improve compliance with environmental public participation. This is the second round, and to identify good practices and innovative ideas in order to improve the work at the Secretariat and the access for citizens. We would like to thank all the people that are in this webinar, because this represents the effort and gives us motivation to continue. We hope that the information that you share will be useful to all. Before going into the topic, I will ask Liliana Paz to please share the logistics, and then I will be back to introduce the director of this meeting. Good morning. Brief instructions for all of you who are connected to the webinar. And this webinar has simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish. So for interpretation, please go to the lower part of the screen, and in the globe, click there and select the language for the interpretation, either English or Spanish. Thank you very much, and have a nice meeting. Mario. Thank you, Liliana. Okay. The SEEMs are an opportunity of public information, access to information, and access to environmental justice. Today, we meet with a group of citizens who have been part of these mechanisms, and we want to exchange experiences, perspectives that these people share, who have been who have attended our invitation to participate and share with you their experiences. The idea is to explore the SEEMs. I would like to introduce Dino Delgado, our friend and of all the secretariats. He is a graduate from the University of San Martin de Porres and from the Catholic University of Peru, has mining master's degree in applied sciences, and his work experience, and he has worked in the National Service of Natural Protected Areas in the state, in the environmental agency, and Dino was also executive director of the Secretariat for Environmental Compliance for Peru, United States, in coordination with the United States in the OEA. He is part of the USAID, and he, before his education, who is a specialist in this area, he has a lot of experience. Dino? Thank you, Mario. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here with you. Also, greetings to all the people who are part of this webinar and who are here with us today. I'm going to share my screen where I have a very brief presentation, which will be useful in order to give you an introduction to the topic, because the specialists are the panelists. And today I'm going to introduce them as they start speaking. Alejandra Aguilar, Johanna Gil, who will be with us today. Thank you very much for your time. Can you see my presentation? Thank you very much. Some news, you have simultaneous interpretation. You can put your questions in the chat or the section that says you and I, questions and answers, which are in the bottom part of the Zoom. You are connected, and we have people from each one of the secretariats, so the difficult questions can be directed to them. And to the panelists, I would like to ask you to please take into consideration the times that you have been assigned, and I will be very watchful of the times in each one of your presentations. So in order to start with this very brief introduction, I wanted to share some slides with you. And the first thing and the first question that I asked myself also when we had this day coming up, why is it relevant to have this discussion? Why is it relevant to talk about the secretariats of the different treaties or the different trade agreements that we have in the region that includes in their articles these agencies and these processes so that the people can be able to send a petition? And it's because they already have a very rich history, and very actively the directors of the secretariats, the civil association, the universities, the NGOs, etc., are discussing and talking about the secretariats. And we need more. If we need more promotion, then we already have a history. And the truth is that in different years, in different stages, we already have more than 25 years of history of these processes. More than 150 petitions submitted in every secretariat, more than 35 factual records, articles, publications that make reference to the benefits and also some weaknesses of the procedure. And we will talk about this a little bit. And also, what is more interesting, the success stories. And what am I talking about when I mention success stories? And I will mention it. I mentioned this later on. The effects that these petitions have presented, not only what the Secretariat has done, but they have released a series of petitions beyond what is managed through the Secretariat. And everything starts more or less with this language. And I say more or less because some of the words can vary a little bit. But in general lines, our commercial trade agreements in North America, Central America, and the Dominican Republic, and the agreement of Peru with the United States, Colombia, and United States, and Panama with the United States, we have a very similar language that invites people, either natural people or legal people, to submit a request if they consider that one of the parties, when we are talking about parties at this time, we're talking about the countries that are part of that treaty or that agreement. They are not applying in an effective manner their environmental laws. So if a person, natural or legal, thinks that this is happening, the texts of the commercial agreements that have been mentioned before offer this option so that people can submit to the secretariats, these requests. And Mario already mentioned this. We're talking specifically of these 5 secretariats. So the history has been changing. How often do we have the submissions? When were they submitted? How many per year? We see that there's some peaks. Some years we have used them more, others less. And the first chart on your left, it's only updated until 2021. And we have had more petitions for today. But we're not talking something new. We're talking about something that already has a history. We're talking about something that has already been used and has been reused. There are petitioners who have presented one application and then another and then another. These are mechanisms that very clearly show that they are useful and that have generated enough trust in the civil association and in certain individuals that have used this process in order to channel their concerns. And we're going to see more or less how this has happened. Organizations of the civil association have been key in this process. There are people, there are persons that individually or several persons that have gathered and presented submissions, and the submissions have been submitted by the civil association. And on the left, the third column that says mixed, these are people, these are individuals and organizations. And almost 70% of the petitions have been submitted, drafted and submitted by organizations of the civil association. We can see that there are definitely a very strategic allied of the secretariat of these processes. And these are people that through organizations that they have trusted in this process, in this unique process that we have today, that we are presenting to you. But every time that we talk about these submissions on enforcement matters, there is something that comes to light. And in the discussions that I have had, for example, we always say, okay, and at the end, what happens? What happens at the end? Are there going to be any sanctions? Are you going to force the government to do something? And many times this is taken like something negative, that it doesn't, not to have a sanction, not to have an obligation at the end of the process so that the governments are obliged to carry out a task in a certain way. There are many positive things, and they make this process special and unique, simple and accessible. And I put 2 asterisks because we're going to talk a little bit about this. We are perceiving this as a process that is simple and accessible. And sometimes the question, the concept is that the requirements are not too difficult to obtain. Let's see if that is happening, and maybe we can ask you, or we can ask our panelists that today. What is the perception from the side of the petitioner? And above all, and I believe that one of the most valuable things is that it includes or involves an organization which is very dependable, which are the secretariats. There's an independent organization that reviews the national law. It is very difficult to find a similar mechanism outside of these secretariats in which we can go to an organization that reviews how the country implemented the environmental law and how they enforced in an effective in the domestic environmental law in an effective manner. Each one of the communications is located in the website of the Secretariat. Each one of the actions that motivated by a submission are available to the people. It facilitates access to the information, and sometimes in some of our countries, it is very difficult for a person to find information or that the government provides specific information regarding an issue that somebody can have. It is very difficult to know where to go. It is very difficult to obtain information on a timely manner. And it is enough to review the submissions or the reports or the answers of the governments to obtain that information that sometimes it is so difficult, or at least in the concept, is difficult to obtain for the people. Regarding this, the citizens and the governments, I would like to, this is, we can also see this in several cases. It is not necessary to conclude a request process so that the governments can take some action based on the concerns that are presented in the petition submissions. The last part of the process are the factual records, and the factual records are independent reports. And in a very interesting manner, as the name says, it's not based on the opinion of the Secretariat or the person that is working at the Secretariat or that assessed the submission. It is based on facts, and this makes it, for me, very interesting. But there is also a lot of submissions that are filed. And here there are some data that I show you of why the majority of the petitions are filed. And it's because of these 4 bullets. Many times the petitioners do not identify the environmental law, or they do not explain in detail that in a detailed manner that they are not enforcing the environmental legislation. There's not sufficient information. And I put a little arrow because there's a number of petitions that have been retreated. And I go back to the previous point. We have at least 12 cases in which the petitioners felt that their concerns were answered before continuing with the process. Therefore, they decided to take them out. They felt that the concern that they have presented in the petition have been responded to. And it is very interesting to know that not non-written function is also being made by some other secretariats. That function of promote a discussion, to promote a debate, and to pay attention to the issues. Finally, and with regards to the factual records, we have, like I mentioned in the beginning, some experiences, success stories. And I'm not talking about that they have the factual record. It's not just a success because they already opened, but they have consequence beyond the elaboration and the publication of the factual records. And these are some examples that maybe we don't have the time to go in depth into them, but these are some examples of factual records that were published that had an impact, that had a reaction, that had a response to the problem. And that way, it is proof that the impact goes beyond the Secretariat, beyond even of the ministries that each countries have. in environmental matters, and they guide the work of the secretariat, and it goes beyond, and they have the desired effects.
So based on all this, it is very important to continue with these procedures. People should know, be familiar with this process, that it is available, that we can consolidate this partnership with the civil society. We can deepen access to data, transparency and inclusion, and also collaborating with the secretariats, which this is an example of this, and to strengthen the institutionality of the different secretariats. Well, this is all from my side. I have tried to do this in 20 minutes. And now I would like to pass the floor to the first panel member that we have today, Pablo Peña. He is a professor of the Catholic Pontificia University of Peru. Pablo published an article a very interesting article about the secretariats and the relationship that these secretariats have with the trade agreements and the impact of the secretariats. And I know that you have focused on Peru's secretariat in the US, but I think your article is very interesting and I would like to congratulate you for that. And today you're going to be talking about Escazú and the submission process we have been discussing right now. So please go ahead, Pablo. Thank you very much, Dino. Thank you to the organizers, and also thank you to all the panel members in today's sessions, as well as to the audience. Let me share my screen, and please, Dino, confirm if you can see my screen. Can you see it now? Okay, great. So you can see the full screen right now, right? Okay, great. Thank you so much. So today I would like to start talking about these two systems Dino has already mentioned. These are relatively new mechanisms. Dino talk about the story of the secretariats and the secretariats in North America, but it's quite, I mean, the secretaries are quite new. On one hand, the Escazú agreement and the secretariats. There are many topics we can discuss, but I would like to focus on environmental defenders. So let me start by reminding the current situation of the people that defend our environment. We have some good news and unfortunately many bad news. On one hand, Honduras found the murderers of Berta Cáceres. You are familiar with Berta Cáceres' case and the intellectual criminal was condemned to prison. According the intellectual actor. And in 2021, 3/4 of the environmental defenders killed in 2021 were from this region. Half were from Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. One is a member of the Escazú agreement, and the other country is about to be part of the Escazú agreement. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Environmental defenders face many problems in very hostile environments. For instance, Salvador, where the government has started or been continued the investigation with Salvadorian environmental defenders to prohibit some kind of mining, and the government is now interested in starting. El Salvador has not signed the Escazú agreement. And I would like to briefly talk about environmental defenders in Peru, a region that has been devastated by illegal mining. They are part of a local organization to protect their forest and Tamubaca area, and they have been threatened by the criminals. In the middle, you can see Alfredo Braco. He was killed in 2015 when he was defending from deforestation this area. So the picture on the right is Juan Julio Fernandez. He and his family have been threatened by criminals due to the fact that they're defending their lands from mining. He was killed a year ago. The person on the left is alive, but he's Demetrio Pacheco in his forest. His son, Roberto Carlos, was killed during the pandemic in September 2020. Before he was killed, both have been um, had filed 5 claims during many years. Let me mention that, in fact, since as it was acknowledged by the Peru representative in the first COP from Escazú, the defenders were under more risk during the pandemic, and none of the people responsible for these deaths have been arrested, and the police is still investigating these cases. And these are just some victims in Peru. 14 environmental defenders have been killed since the pandemic started, including a woman, and many are indigenous people from the Amazon. In this terrible context, provided the merge of the Escazú agreement. So it started in 2018 and became in effect a couple of years ago. 24 countries are signatories, and we have 15 parties on. You can see the Secretariat of the Environment in Peru signing the Escazú agreement, but at the end, this agreement was not ratified by Peru, and you can see the president of Peru, located in that visited Colombia for the Escazú agreement, but this is in progress. The purpose of the agreement is to create better regional practices to improve the three access rights: access to public information, public participation, and access to justice. But the agreement also involves environmental defenders, and it has become the first legally binding international law agreement that includes the environmental defenders. Many of our Latin American countries are signatories of the Escazú agreement, and they are also part of these secretaries for environmental enforcement law. Is here you can see the convergence. You can see the countries that are under the secretariat system. You are knowledgeable of these systems, and I'm not going to talk a lot about them. And in red, you can see the countries that are under secretariat systems, and at the same time, they are part of the Escazú agreement. We have three: Nicaragua, Panama, and Mexico. And they include three different secretariats, and in pink, the ones that are that have secretariat systems and are part of the Escazú agreement. Peru, Costa Rica, and Guatemala, and Colombia is in process of being part of the Escazú agreement, but they have not ratified it. It is important because it will allow to strengthen environmental law in justice, information, and engagement. And this is a legislation that has to be enforced by the states. And if this is not done effectively, submission can be filed to the secretaries. What does this convergence mean for environmental defenders? We can see that all submitters are also environmental defenders, right? Because at least in Mexico, Nicaragua, and Panama, they will be protected by the new standards of the Escazú agreement. Now, what does the agreement do to defend environmental defenders? It has one article, just one article that addresses human rights of environmental defenders. But in my opinion, the most important article is Article 9 that creates three obligations. First, a general obligation for the states to guarantee a safe environment for all environmental defenders. Second, this is an ex ante obligation to implement effective measures to recognize, protect, and promote all human rights of environmental defenders. This means protect violations to their human rights by the states or the companies. For these measures, the states have to consider other international obligations, human rights under the Inter-American organization. The states can include their own constitutional principles and the basic concepts of their legal system. And finally, the states have to take appropriate and effective as well as timely measures to prevent, investigate, and punish attacks, threats, or intimidations. And when these happen, the states or countries have to investigate it and punish it. So I would like to highlight something we know. One of the failures in our legislation is time. This happens very frequently in Peru. Investigations and judicial processes take too much time, decades, or even decades. So the justice should be strengthened with more capacities and resources. Yesterday, I was talking with some environmental prosecutors, and they were talking about processes that have been completed or that were completed 5 years ago, but they have not asked the parties to summon. Now, there are other things that are part of the Escazú agreement, but they are not implicitly developed for environmental defenders, but they are benefited by them. So I'm going to explain how this happens in Article 4. For example, the states have to acknowledge or recognize people and organizations that promote environmental protection and their work. So this would be an important step to eliminate stigmatization in some contexts. In cases before the secretaries, that states have to consider how the submitters are recognized in a positive manner, even though they are being defended. So under the secretariat framework. On the other hand, the environmental defenders may also be under that definition on persons or groups in vulnerable situations. In this case, this is interesting, but they would have the right to have a special assistance for their access rights and also to have assistance on technical and legal affairs to have access to environmental justice. So we have to see how submitters before the Secretariat can have special assistance in their states to continue the cases against those states. It also consolidates a principle of non-environmental regression. This principle of environmental rights is not explicit in some agreements in Latin America, but it is important to help and shield some states. So the principle of non-regression includes on the USMCA so that the states do not reduce the enforcement of environmental law, and the secretariats are responsible for reviewing those submissions. Another topic has to do with the access to environmental information. States can create some exceptions to principle of maximum disclosure, but this should include the information they have about environmental defenders to avoid putting them at risk. This has to do with the environmental defenders that are included in the submissions before the Secretariat. It is interesting also that under the Escazú agreement, the states have to promote partnerships with states of other regions. So as I was saying, they have to promote partnerships with states from other regions. And as I was saying, we have to see how some submitters from the Secretary should have assistance from the states. And another important thing is that the states have to issue periodic national reports to include information about the environmental defender situation, independent reports on the environmental performance, and everything is promoted by the Escazú Agreement. And these independent assessments can include useful information for the submitters, or that or maybe the secretariats could use this information for the factual records. The states are committed to create and strengthen capacities, which should include environmental defenders. One of the measures that have been proposed by the Escazú Agreement is that the state should recognize the importance of the organizations and groups that train or make people aware about the access right. So first of all, we have to strengthen capacities and train them on how to access to the secretariats. And second, to acknowledge the importance of people making others aware of the environmental issues. We had already mentioned this, that one finding is that most of them are civil society organizations. On the other hand, states commit to cooperate and to promote partnerships with states with those states that have higher standards to protect the environment, and helping other states that are staying behind. So the states that are part of the Escazú Agreement that have had a more positive impact can collaborate with states or secretariats with less experience and that have not been protecting the submitters. It is interesting that under the Escazú Agreement, the states have to promote partnership with states from other regions and intergovernmental organizations. This can bring a series of opportunities, and this is also has a relationship with a mandate to enforce. It is a subsidiary or a body from the Escazú Agreement, so it cooperates with other organizations to enforce the agreement. This is a space of coordination should be between this subsidiary body from the agreement and the secretariats. The agreement created a voluntary fund to help the different states, and we can focus or allocate this fund to defend environmental and protect environmental defenders. And this fund can support those organizations that can become potential submitters. This is a fund or subsidiary body could play a very important role. For instance, the committee has to support the implementation and compliance, to receive communications and provide recommendations as well. And even this body can create an action plan for the states to report their progress. Specifically, the committee can recommend the stakeholder some necessary measures to safeguard environmental defenders involved in a specific case. So if there is a case related to a certain state, a communication and a submission before the secretariat, the committee can recommend the secretariat to protect that environmental defender. And how to have address the recommendations from the Escazú Agreement that can come from the secretariat. So there are many possible coordination between the states that are part of both the committee and the secretariat. The Escazú Agreement created a new ad hoc working group on environmental defenders, which will develop an action plan in 2024. This action plan should plan the coordination with the secretariats in the countries where they operate, and also consider how environmental defenders can have access to the secretariats.
Que traigo la discusión ahora. Hay varios más que podríamos identificar en convergencia entre Escazú y las secretarías en materia de defensores ambientales, pero creo que son suficientes para mostrar cómo la
But I think
convergencia
that they are sufficient to see how we generically, how can see that both environments respond to environmental defenders? But we had to take advantage of the opportunity to see specific things that would help the petitioners and the environmental defenders. I want to make, I think that this convergence is very interesting. It's not part of Escazú, at least not now, but I think that the example is worthwhile. Peru has made legislative progress in environmental policies and a record to protect them, to protect the defenders, and to carry out investigations for the environmental defenders. Now, these norms are environmental laws covered by the Secretariat. Environmental laws, according to the Peru agreement, the first one and who issues the rules, for example, the law of the Congress or the decree of resolution promulgated by the central level. Second, they have to deal with topics like contamination or damage to natural resources. But this definition of the free trade agreement not only protects the object, but how is it protected, the procedure, and by whom, the people. So I consider that we shouldn't have any doubts that the norms that we have to protect the people, who protect the environment, should also be covered by this legislation, and it should be under the Secretariat. When we talk about protecting the environment, we're not talking only about situations like this one. This is the illegal mining in Peru, but who does it affect? The victims, and many of them are environmental defenders. I don't have any more time, but I would like to leave this final reflections. The first one is very obvious. The standards for environmental defenders in Escazú should help protect petitioners before the SALA-SEEMs. And not only to protect, but to facilitate their participation in the Secretariat. Two, most or almost all the legislation to protect environmental defenders should be understood as environmental law in under these treaties, and therefore be subject to the Secretariat's opportunities for exchange of information. And three, opportunities for exchange of information and institutional coordination between SEMs. I already mentioned several examples. It is a good coincidence that while we had this meeting, the parties of Escazú are also meeting, and I hope that in the future we don't have parallel meetings, but a joint meeting between the secretariats and the group of Escazú in order to protect environmental defenders in our countries. And with that, thank you. Thank you, Pablo, for your presentation. Very interesting. These three reflections that you gave us, the relationship between Escazú and the Secretariat, and also going beyond that, the definition of environmental legislation in each one of the commercial treaties. And this is something that I feel has been part of several of the petitions. All the secretariats, when they receive the submissions, they have to analyze whether it's an environmental law, and we had to make a reference to each one of the submissions, and we have to have a very rich analysis, like we have seen in the more than 150 petitions that have been submitted. Thank you. I'm sure that in the time for questions and answers, we will have some questions for you. Now, I would like to invite Sandra Mughal. Sandra has a lot of experience in the submission process in North America, so that she can give us a perspective on the side of the petitioner. Sandra is part of the AIDA. Sandra, I invite you to share with us your experience with the submission process. You have approximately 20 minutes, and to ask you to take into consideration the interpreters, please, to speak a little bit slower. Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen.
Sí me alcanzan a ver, ¿verdad? Sí. Ay. Ok, listo. Bueno, pues de nuevo, gracias por
Ahora
la...
estamos.
Okay. Thank you to the organizers also.
Por la invitación a este conversatorio. Y la presentación la abordaremos de la siguiente manera.
The presentation will be presented as follows. We have one of the submissions, one of the citizens submissions that has been submitted under AIDA, and we will present some of the advantages of the use of the tools of from the civil society perspective, and we will talk about the challenges and opportunities to strengthen public participation in accountability, which is the purpose of this tool that we have in the treaty agreements. I would like to introduce ourselves. We are this is as part of the Civil Association, and we protect the environment and human rights of the communities that depend from this. We are currently 42 people who are collaborating, attorneys, scientists. We were born and live in Latin America. It's the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense. And we have presence in several parts of the continent. I'm in Ensenada, Baja California, Mexico, and our work has as transversal approach these three programs that are climate, human rights, and ecosystems. The topic of marine and coastal biodiversity protection is part of the ecosystems program. In AIDA, what we do is that we carry out international strategies and regional strategies that give added value to the local actions and national actions that are carried out by other organizations. One of the selection criteria that we have to select the cases has to do with the site or the species that we protect. Some of our work has been recently to accompany the North American bloc in the World Organization on Trade, as well as the protection of fishery and the Treaty of High Seas. These are some of the examples. And AIDA has been working with national organizations in the Gulf of California or Mar de Cortés for approximately 15 years. And that would be the site in the case study that I'm going to present today. The Gulf of California has been named as the World Aquarium because it houses more than 900 species of fishes. 90% of our endemic, the tatuaba, the marina, the vaquita, among others, and 39 of the mammals of the world live here. The gray whale, the loggerback, and more than 400,000 species, marine vertebrae. And this is a habitat of migratory birds, coral reefs, manglers, and since 2004, part of the protected areas of the Gulf of California have been human heritage by UNESCO and has a lot of sites protected. The communities in the Gulf of California depend largely on natural resources. And when talking about manglers and reefs, coral reefs, the species are very high. It produces 70% of the national fishery and artisanal, and because of the scenic and landscaping, the region attracts many tourists, and many of the communities have focused on ecotourism. And however, with the construction of massive buildings, the social conflicts have also grown due to the fact that with these projects, they do not plan the basic infrastructure like wastewater treatment plant, potable water, the construction of highways, the disposal of waste. And it takes us to the decrease of quality of life of the communities and also of natural resources. Because its closeness to the United States, the Gulf of California is ideal for people who carry out tourism, but also who would like to live close to the United States. There's why there are many projects with foreign capital that have proposed the building of hotels and housing in this area. So environmental local groups and national groups have focused their efforts in questioning different strategies, such as political incidents and also the evaluations of environmental impact from the legal perspective, project by project. Also taking into consideration one of the efforts of an ally, when he made a publication and they made a very detailed investigation of a project which is called the evaluation of environmental impact in the Northeast, Mexican Northeast Territory. And it had the same violations or for the Mexican laws for those projects. For example, we were talking about the proof based on obsolete science. The environmental impact studies were in fragments. They didn't take the projects completely. They didn't take the projects completely, and they didn't put what were the environmental impacts, and they didn't put the accumulative impacts of buildings that are already built in this area. And it was seen that systematically the evaluating authority in this case, which is Semarnat, which is the Secretariat of Natural Resources and the Environment in Mexico, was not doing a very real study of environmental impact, and they were infringing in the laws, and that was something very important from the civil society perspective. And the civil society was investing their own resources, and they would look at case by case. And this is that we decided to select a mechanism where we can have a discussion regarding the authorizations of projects in the Gulf of California. So together with our Air Justice ally, representing 11 submissions, we presented the submission for enforcement in environmental laws that was called Tourist Development for the Gulf of California. And this was the main action. But as a complement, we carried out other actions like creating common projects. We had press bulletins in both languages to publish them in the United States and Mexico. Also electronic information and from people who were acknowledged, scientists that were acknowledged in the United States and Mexico, and also letters, blogs. We had a lot of official communication with the authorities, and we also made presentations at the Mexican Senate based on submissions on citizens' petitions. So we had 4 case studies which are iconic. These are projects that were being built at the wetlands in or with the acknowledgement as natural heritage of humanity, areas with mangroves and coral reefs. Specifically in Cabo Cortés, the Hans Urbana wanted to build in 3,500 hectares marine 500 spaces and 3 golf courses and 3,000 hotel rooms. And this infrastructure was going to be close to Cabo Pulmo, which is a reef reef that is more closer to the northern hemisphere and it has very important marine life. The other case study has to do with Bahía de la Paz, which is the paradise of the sea. And between them, they were planting 12,000 hotel rooms, golf courses, and 2 marines of 500 spaces for yachts in each one. In Bahía de la Paz has a high biodiversity. And the Escuinapa in Sinaloa, which belongs to the Mexican government, wanted to build in 2,500 hectares, more than 50,000 hotel rooms, golf courses, and this would be the Marismas Nacionales in Sinaloa, which is one of the preferred sites for migratory birds and for fish. And this is one of the most productive areas in the country for fish. And like I had told you, these case studies had in common several relationships that we identified as systematic for environmental law. So specifically, the violations that we identified in the submission were based on the general law of ecological balance and environmental protection, the environmental impact, natural protected areas, general law of wildlife, the species in risk, at risk, and norm 022, which is for species or conditions to preserve manglers, as well as the Ramsar Convention in Mexico. When we decided to use the mechanism of SEMS, the results were that we were expecting as a civil society was a factual record and have a serious investigation, and that it would establish that the evaluation of environmental impact was not just one more process or one more paperwork. So we wanted to have this acknowledgement of the systematic violation on behalf of the evaluating authorities in Mexico, in this case, Semarnat, and that they were not applying or omitting the environmental impact laws. We were also trying that, and that factual record could be used as a follow-up plan, and that at that time we didn't have that part within the process of the submission process, but we saw it like that it would be like a route page. And lastly, we also were trying that with the mechanism, we could start a dialogue with the Mexican authorities and have also the national enforcement of international treaties and specifically Ramsar. Well, even though the Secretariat of the CC told us to have the SEMS in CC, Canada and the United States voted against. But to be honest, the civil association feels that we were deceived because we didn't have that detailed investigation, which was the factual records. However, we rescued many actions that worked in order to place this discussion in an international forum, and that Mexico was able to express their institutional response beyond the answers that we could have because of transparency response.
de ellos como parte, pero también de Canadá, ¿no? Nos llamaba la atención
It
que
called our
en ese
it called
momento
our
los
attention
políticos
that the
canadienses se
civil
trataba
society
de un voto
was
político,
wondering if
aunque
it
en
was a
realidad
political
nosotros,
vote.
al haber
And
obtenido la
when we
determinación
got the
del secretariado,
secretariat
sentíamos
opinion,
pues que habíamos
we
logrado
felt, or
parte
determination, we
del
thought
objetivo.
that we had achieved part of
Y
the
bueno,
objective.
pues como las oportunidades
So just
eh,
like any
o
other
efectos
opportunity,
que tuvimos en este
or
caso
the
al
effect
presentarlo,
that we have
es que
in
a
this
través
case
de
I
esta
just
petición
presented is
ciudadana
that through
1301,
this
desarrollo turístico del Golfo
SEM
de California,
1301
pudimos expresar
Gulf of
nuestra posición
California
civil
tourism
y también
development, we
posicionamos
were
un
able
tema
to
de
express
interés
ourselves
pues
as
para
a
el
civil
sector
society, and it became
y
a
cuestionamos
topic
pues
of
la
interest
inversión
in
y
the
el
sector, and we
comercio
questioned the
en México a
investment
costa de los
and
derechos
trade
ambientales y el
in
cumplimiento de la
Mexico
legislación ambiental
by not
particularmente
taking
para el
into
desarrollo
account the environment
turístico.
for the tourism
Tuvimos una postura
real
adicional
estate
por parte de
development.
las
We got
autoridades
the
mexicanas,
position
ya
from the
más allá
Mexican
de dar
authorities,
respuestas
and
a
not
nuestras
only
reclamaciones
the
públicas.
mere
Y
answers
conseguimos en
for
varias
public
ocasiones dialogar
transparency
directamente
platforms,
con
and
las
we were
autoridades
able to have
gracias al
this
apoyo que nos
discussion
estaba brindando
with the
este tipo de
authorities thanks
procesos.
to the form that we got from
Por
the
último, también quiero
submission
resaltar
of
que nos
on
sirvió
enforcement matters.
muchísimo para
And
poder
it also
habilitar
helped
un
us a lot
video
to
entre el
start
sector
an
civil
internal
ambiental y
discussion
nos otorgó la
between the
oportunidad de fungir
civil
como
environmental
termómetro de
organizations,
cómo
and
la
we
sociedad
were
civil
also a
espera se
thermometer on how
aplique
the civil
de manera efectiva
organization
la legislación ambiental,
expects
en este
the
caso
environmental
específico la evaluación de
law
impacto
to be
ambiental y los
enforced,
desarrollos sectoriales
specifically
técnicos
on the
específicamente enfocados
environmental impact
a zonas
assessment
vulnerables
in
y de
highly
máxima
vulnerable
diversidad como el Golfo de
sites
California.
with great diversity, such as the Gulf of
Y bueno, como
California.
conclusiones,
And as
me
conclusions,
gustaría
I
aquí
would like to
expresar que
mention
desde
and
AIDA
express
consideramos que el
that from
mecanismo de
in
peticiones
AIDA,
ciudadanas
we
sí es un
consider
espacio de
that the
participación y de
mechanism of
discusión,
submission of on
muestra que
enforcement
no solo
matters
hay
is a
razones
space
de
for
plantear
public
tiempos más
participation that works in
ambiciosos y
where more
extraordinarios,
ambitious
sino que
timelines
los
and a
hay de
follow
hechos
plan to the
desde
factual
nuestra
record
perspectiva,
are
pues definitivamente es
proposed,
mucho más prometedor.
and it is even
Siendo
more
uno de los
promising.
pocos espacios de
Being one
participación
of the
pública
few
planteados
spaces
o
for
sentados en la
public
mesa para
participation
salvaguardar el
proposed in
ambiente,
trade agreements to
la
safeguard the
perspectiva
environment,
de nuestra organización
AIDA's
es que
expectation
derivado de la
is that
experiencia en este
once the
caso
Secretariat
del desarrollo
determines that
turístico
there
del
is
Golfo de
sufficient
California,
evidence
la
and
votación para
arguments
la
for its
elaboración de
celebration,
decretos
the vote
tendré
for
como
the
finalmente
elaboration
el
of a
secretariado determinar
factual
que sí hay suficiente
record,
evidencia y
once the
argumentos
Secretary
para
determines
su
that there is
elaboración,
sufficient evidence
pues
and
debería
argument
ser
for its celebration, should
afirmativo
be
con tan solo un voto a
affirmative with
favor de las
only one vote
partes,
in favor
como
of the
sucede
parties, as happens
en el
in
Tratado de Libre
the
Comercio entre
mechanisms
las
of
mencionadas
submission
en
of
Nueva York y
enforcement
Estados
matters
Unidos.
of the
Recuerde,
environmental
esto es
legislation
mucho
of
más
the Free
lineal a
Trade
los
Agreement
asuntos
on the
planteados
Dominican
en la
Republic,
petición
Central
y a su
America,
vez
and the United
despertaría
States,
mucho
CAFTA,
más interés en la
DR.
sociedad civil.
This would speed up the issues raised in the
Definitivamente
CEC,
consideramos
and
que
at the
este
same time
mecanismo,
would awaken
pues
much
bueno,
more interest in civil
tiene que ser
society.
mucho más
This
eficiente y eso
mechanism should
significa
be
que
much more
realmente necesita
efficient,
una
and this
posibilidad
means
de que
that
se
there should
obtenga
be the
un
possibility
expediente de
of
hechos
obtaining
sin
a
garantizar
factual
una
record
medida.
if the
Y bueno, y
submission
en la plataforma actual hemos visto que hay mucha
meets
más
all the
participación
requirements.
también
We
en
have
temas
seen that there
pesqueros
is more
y una
participation
gran cantidad de
on
peticiones,
fishing
por lo que
related
significa
topics,
que la
and
sociedad
that
civil cada
means that
vez
civil
pues tiene más
society
conocimiento de esta
is more
herramienta
knowledgeable of the
y también
tool,
está funcionando
and
pues
it
justamente
is
como un
also
mecanómetro para
working
que las
as a
partes o
thermometer
estados
for
partes
the
puedan también
parties
pues identificar
for
cuáles
the
son
state
esos temas de
parties
mayor
may
preocupación por parte de la
identify
sociedad civil
with
y como
those topics
termómetro,
that
insisto,
are
cómo
a
la sociedad civil
concern
espera
for
que se
the
esté
civil
aplicando la
society and the
legislación
expectations from the
ambiental. Y
civil
bueno, solamente
society
quiero cerrar
to enforce the
diciendo
environmental
que
laws. And I just
en
want to
nuestra
close by
experiencia,
saying that based on
el
our
mecanismo de peticiones
experience,
ciudadanas
the
definitivamente
submission on
cierto
enforcement
pues los
matters
procedimentales debería seguir.
includes
Muchas veces
processes
cuando
that are
estamos
feasible.
identificando las
Many times
expectativas
when we
civil, por supuesto,
identify the
siempre sigue siendo
strategies to
una
follow,
posibilidad. Pero hemos
litigation is
notado
or
además que
prosecution
el
is
tema del
one
interés legítimo,
possibility,
es
but
decir, la
the
legitimación activa, el
legitimate
reconocimiento para que
interest,
presentemos casos ante
the
jueces
recognition to
tribunales, a
submit
veces
cases
eso
or
realmente
present
toma
file cases before the courts take a long time, but we don't have open doors, unlike the SAM processes. So I want to highlight that from AIDA's perspective, we do consider that this is an adequate space for us to submit our concerns, and we will continue using these mechanisms as well as analog mechanisms in free trade agreements. Thank you very much for inviting me to present in this session. Sandra, thank you so much for your presentation. Your presentation has been very clear and interesting, especially the experience that you shared from AIDA's side and not being able to have a factual record, but being able to get to that stage was enriching for the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense. Sometimes there are subtle differences between the voting processes in each agreement, in each free trade agreement in the region. Thank you so much for your participation, and later on we will continue with the Q&A session. So please stop sharing your screen. And now I would like to welcome Alejandra Aguilar. She is the point of contact with the Foreign Trade Secretariat in Costa Rica. Alejandra, please share with us your experience from your position and tell us, please, how have you been involved in the processes with the secretariats? And please take 20 minutes in your presentation. Thank you so much. I am very happy to be here. Definitely, I will not take those 20 minutes, and the extra minutes can be used in a question and answers session. And I am very passionate about this because I have had the opportunity for many years, and I'm not going to say how many, but I have been able to see how this mechanism works in practice and within the framework in the CAFCA, in the Dominican Republic and CAFCA. And I want to say that my experience has included best practices in the CAFTA Foreign Affairs Minister. So we can we have shown this as a best practice example for the OECD forum, and a mechanism that a mechanism we're very proud of. I understand that many things can be improved from the Secretariat's point of view and the different governments' point of view as well. So we can classify this as a public participation mechanism, but in its structure, it is a participation mechanism, a dialogue and control. So the best or good practices from my perspective on how to use this judicial or a legal tool derived from a trade agreement help us manage this dialogue, control, and participation space can become a useful tool for all the stakeholders and can help us improve the different environmental policies and legislation in the region. The Ministry of Environmental Matters has been very interesting. Participation of the citizens in the region has been interesting. It is a mechanism that generate options in countries with very complex environmental laws and and with very complex environmental laws and policies. So this is an example of good practices on how to channel and support this public participation. The Secretariat has devoted to doing an outreach process in the region so this mechanism can be known and facilitate that the organizations and citizens uh, to use this mechanism and can have a wider participation. And this does not have to be underestimated. This is especially useful when a citizen files a submission is because the citizen is frustrated because there's no more dialogue or discussion, and the Secretariat has had this flexibility to create dialogue channels. So these dialogue channels are opened between the citizens and the government. This is closely done with the different points of contact in the different governments in the region. And many times these channels can be used to address the case or creating a joint action plan. Dialogue is extremely important and I would not underestimate it. Many times there is no dialogue due to a series of events. Maybe a government does not prioritize as a situation that is happening because there are financial interests, and the Secretariat opens these channels of dialogue. We have to do something, let's have a conversation. So this has been very valuable. And also control. We have to bear in mind that this is a control mechanism, a soft control mechanism from the government's side, and every government has to have weight and counterweight systems. This has allowed us to bring to light some events that otherwise would be very difficult to visualize, as our former panel member case. So this is a control mechanism that provides other mechanisms to civil society to be able to bring things to the table, to have a dialogue and to have a better impact on environmental conflicts. So I think that most important thing in this mechanism is that creates an institutionalized space which was created, derived from an international agreement. So it is also a flexible mechanism that allows us, from my experience, um, to have a series of ways to address a problem that include mediation, creating dialogue, or creating a hard control and a tool to point out certain things to the government. And if this or case becomes a factual record, it becomes an important matter to be addressed by the government. So please uh, be thoughtful of this mechanism. This is a very useful mechanism, and the Secretariat is a live mechanism that allows for more dialogue, more control, more participation, and also environmental protection in each of our regions. So that's all from my side, and thank you so much. Thank you very much, Alejandra. Everything you mentioned has been very interesting. We have a couple of minutes, and I would like to ask you something that is very important. So it's the participation and also the control that you mentioned. I think that your perspective is really enriching. and also your experience through the CAFTA. It is a consolidated mechanism. It is not a mechanism. It is a mechanism with a very interesting story, history, and with many submissions. But we have quite a new secretariats with less years of experience. So from your point of view as a point of contact, do you feel that initially there could be a certain fear from the government on how on the effect that a submission will have in government, and if you feel if that fear has dissipated and now there is a collaboration between the governments and the secretariat. And I understand by your presentation is that you feel that the interaction is actually very positive. Can you comment on that? Yes, of course. I think that it is that the word that derived from the submission is complex because the secretariat has to act from the submitter's perspective and also from the government. From the government perspective, I think that that all the governments will feel threatened when when someone wants to control us. In other words, when I feel that there is going to be a communication against the government of Costa Rica, obviously one is getting ready to face war. But I do believe that it is part of the Secretariat's work to create this channel of dialogue, because we want to create this channel of dialogue, but we do not win anything if we create an accusatory situation. So we have to create this dialogue, and we have to be very sensitive and be knowledgeable of our institutions. So we have to create dialogue, and the secretariat of the CAFTA, or the Dominican Republic and Central America FTA, Free Trade Agreement, has been very positive, because the way the communication takes place can become an improvement opportunity, and we have to teach the government how this can become an improvement opportunity, so we can lower the level of need of defending itself and see how we can improve the situation. Not all cases are the same. I don't want to be naive about this, but dialogue or opening a channel of dialogue always facilitates how to handle a certain event. And it always helps if the secretariat presents itself with this positive attitude on how to improve a situation. And this has been a very good practice, and we would like all secretaries to have the same attitude, to detect when the secretariat can facilitate or conciliate, because many times getting to a factual record is an important matter for the civil society, but it's not always the case. But if we can generate this dialogue, as we have generated in many cases, it is a success, and it is a success that is not reflected in a factual record, but based on what I have witnessed in the region, many positive things have happened in the region. This is an ability and a good practice on how this situation is addressed to provide tools to everyone, not only to submitters, but also to governments so they can handle things much better. Not always do governments have the tools to have this dialogue or to address an event. Okay, thank you so much for your input, Alejandra. So we will see you in the Q&A session. Now, I would like to pass the floor to Johanna. Johanna Hill, thank you very much for being here this morning. Johanna, today you are with us as part of the civil society, as representative of the Salvador's civil society, but it is important to mention that you were the Dominican Republic, Central American FTA, and the Salvador Free Trade Agreement negotiator and vice minister of economy and in El Salvador. And I would like you to invite you to have this conversation on the submissions, on your experience, and on your different points of view from your position as a negotiator and as a civil society organization representative. Thank you very much, Dino. Thank you, everyone, for providing me this opportunity to talk about environmental communication mechanisms in the Americas. It caught my attention that that worldwide there are different ways between the trade, environment, and development. In the Americas, we are analyzing the outcome of a collaboration model that has been very successful as of course as improvement opportunities, and we have found a very good formula to build a good relationship between the environment and the trade through different mechanisms, through technical assistance, and also from this to the use of controversies solutions, and also the environmental communications that we have in the different treaties that not only do they encourage dialogue among the different points of contact in the secretariats and the council, but also the fact that these mechanisms open the door for civil society organizations dialogues in our countries, in our developing countries. There is the absence of regulations to effectively enforce environmental laws, but also we have issues on law enforcement as a whole. So we have to see those mechanisms in the government, but also in the civil society. I think that institutionality in the CAFTA, in the Dominican Republic, Central American FTA, have created a very important plan for the civil society to increase their capacities to become a collaborative party in the submission on enforcement matters. Submitters have to understand that there is an open door in a free trade agreement, and sometimes the submitter, after the end of the process, the communication was not well presented because we had not understood exactly how things worked. So this is something that has to involve both sides, and we have to be prepared. Even though it is a mechanism that can be easily enforced, we need to be knowledgeable of it. So this includes 4 factors that I would like to detail specifically. First of all, that there is a political job in the secretaries, and through this support, we have been given different mechanisms. Central America and the support of the Secretariat of SECA, the support in the US, the Department of the USDR has included that the Secretariat has personnel offices and budgets to do the job. And this has done the outreach work and serious investigation, research, and collaborating.
Ministra, yo considero que para el Estado no ha sido fácil.
And it has been easy to see the challenges and being open to a scrutiny and to talk about highly complex situations. And this has included problems with the authority in the trade and environment. And I think that we should not underestimate the support of the institutions. The second factor is that it has been the follow-up on the ministry, follow-up on since 2019, and there was a need of having a strategy with the civil society because it was necessary to have this open door with the mechanism and prepare it.
Has allowed us to know all the Central American, their challenges, their needs, as well as to facilitate the access to the mechanism. And it has also allowed us to create alliances with the social association and the private sector. So one of the strategy that has the support of environmental issues has allowed us that tool for the civil association, for example, in El Salvador, we developed a chart regarding citizens' participation in the environment that explains how, with the charts, how to apply this mechanism, how to be a role player. And I wanted to mention that social associations in the American Association in general, the work has been done in the framework of the mechanism can be positive, and that when we ask support for preparation. This has been very important in the academia, in developing capabilities. We have people who are specialized and provide support, and they are interested in collaborating and in knowing more details. And its success, the mechanism in itself has concrete conditions, like Alejandra mentioned. This means communications that we can present, that they receive answers, that the petitioner has answers, and this is very important because these tools that are effective, they don't have a flexibility, and that's what we all are looking to have. And looking towards the future, I believe that it is important to work in some topics in this sense, but also with a different approach. I think that it is very important the environmental agencies to continue supporting the work and members of the social society. And as time is going by, we have more younger people, and we have people in academia. We have a new university students, and we have people in Central America that it is important for them to know about this topic. I think that we should take advantage of technology, of communication, in order to reach a larger number of members of the civil society. which in another way would be difficult to reach them with older tools, and to continue supporting with the materials, with considerations and the reality of the different groups of the civil society, populations with low education. I think that the the secretariat is doing is to continue supporting with educational material and specialized educational material. That what does it mean to enforce environmental laws when we're talking at a municipal level or a level of the country, and also the conflict, for example, the conflict in mining, or what happens if we don't apply the environmental law with regards to forestry or with water. So I think that we need a lot of work there. And finally, it is very important to continue expanding not only environmental justice and to continue promoting environmental justice in order to be able to continue working on capability on the implementation of this program. Thank you very much, Johanna. Very interesting. Thank you very much for you sharing your experience. And also this perspective and being, especially what you mentioned regarding the environmental rights board and all the boards of all the secretariats. And in a few moments, I will ask you some questions regarding that. Thanks to all the panelists for their participation, for their presentations, very clear, very enriching, and they also promote the exchange of information, the debate, the exchange of ideas also. Based on what I have gathered, I would like to ask some questions. And I would like to ask you to have very brief answers in order to ask as many questions as possible. The first one, this is a question for Sandra. Sandra, you mentioned the experience of AIDA, and almost towards the end of your presentation, you talked about other mechanisms, other routes that AIDA was using also in order to channel certain concerns. For example, processes, maybe more legalized processes. Do you consider, or from AIDA, from the Civil Association, do you consider that this process of petitions, besides this, can this be a product that can be used in other areas? For example, the factual records, the elaboration of a factual record on behalf of the Secretariat, and even some of the reports issued by the Secretariat. Do you think that this is a useful product that can be used in other areas? I'm sorry, we can't hear her.
Tienes el micrófono apagado, Sandra, si quieres, préndelo para que te podamos escuchar. Sí.
Perdón, ¿ahí me escuchan bien?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Bueno, hay un fallo técnico.
Technical problems. Thank you for the question, Dino. And yes, definitely the question is yes. In fact, in the case of in the case study they are just presented in that example, we have used part of the answers of the determination of the Secretariat for different things like opinions in amicus in some cases, and even in suits, or in that case, the Secretariat enforces the Ramsar and the resolutions. of the SALA Convention with regards to the enforcement in Mexico. And we have definitely been using it in other topics. Basically, it's like support to the argument that we already presented. This doesn't mean that it happens in all the cases, but for us, the fact of arriving to a determination and that we acknowledge that we have the merits for deal with the problem, I mean, with the discussion that we are proposing. As a civil society, we have used it in different strategies. And yes, definitely, I think that the impact goes beyond the factual records, and that's what I wanted to mention. Yeah, thank you. Yes, it is interesting. It is interesting to think on how we can use the secretariat in a complementary way in other processes. And I want to take advantage and there are questions in the chat. Specifically, there's a last question that has been made from Mexico, from Diana Escobedo. Thank you very much, Diana. And they're talking about the installation of an ammonia plant in a Ramsam site. And Mexico is part of the Treaty of North America. And can it be used? I don't want to answer the question, but knowing a little bit more of information, yes, this is precisely the secretariat, in this case, the SAM unit of the CEC of North America is precisely where we can channel this type of concerns. I don't know, Sandra, if you wanted to add something, because you spoke about North America. Yes, thank you. Paulo has raised his hand. Yes, definitely in our experience, it's feasible to use it. Of course, there are certain criteria that we have to meet. And from our perspective, it hasn't been as difficult, but I understand that to have that prior communication with the authorities can make it difficult to have access to the mechanism. And I think, Paulo, thank you, Sandra, and the directors of the Secretariat who are with us. Paulo Solano can make a comment. Yes, thank you very much. The SEMS is available in the case that Diana Escobedo is presenting. In the internet page of the CEC, cec.org, we have a file for SIM, and we have a formula online. You can fill it out, and we are available also to answer any questions or any doubts that you might have regarding to how to present the submission and the mechanisms. And I could also underline this topic. If you give us the information of the identification of personnel, the name of the petitioner, and you can also put it as anonymous or confidential. I'm sorry, it's confidential. And anybody who submits a petition, we treat it as confidential information unless you give us the contrary information. It is important to submit support information regarding the lack of environmental law, enforcing the environmental law in any cases or any communication that has been submitted to the authorities, the environmental authorities regarding this issue. any public complaint that has been submitted or a third party that has been used with regards to this issue. Our contact information is on the CC webpage, cc.org. And there, if you want to get in touch with us, we are available. Thank you very much, Paolo. And I'm going to take advantage that we have a beautiful view of the room where all of you are in order to make one more consultation to the directors that are there today. Jorge, how are you? Can you briefly mention in your experience in the CAFTA DR, the communication or the communication of the process? What are the challenges? What are the most important challenges, or what are the most important successes in all these years in order to be able to share information regarding the secretariat, share information regarding the process, and also share information regarding the success of the petitions that have been submitted to CAFTA DR? Thank you, Dino, and greetings to all. I think that it is important in the case of CAFTA, there are 6 parts where we do outreach in Central America and Dominican Republic. So this represents a challenge to go to the different places and to the different countries and then go to the interior if that is the case. So there, I believe that we are starting to have the first challenges, the amount of parties, and also, if it is true, Central America is a country that has has a lot of similarities, and it also has important differences. The approach from the civil society regarding the protection of the resources and the environment in general. So we have to have a very careful strategy with the experience that we've had of how to approach the different sectors, how to approach the civil society, which is organized, which works on environmental issues. And in some countries, the environmental approach is different from environmental rights and environmental justice. And also the messages that will be sent have to be arranged. And according to that, we have different alliances with universities or legal clinics so that the civil association or the civil society, the civil society can have the adequate advice to submit petitions or to go to national agencies in order to solve or to complain about something that is of concern. I think that a successful outreach should be developed, taking into consideration all those complexities. In our case, it's a multilateral agreement, and it has been a challenge since the pandemic. Since the pandemic has been more complicated, and we should have strategies like this one that makes it easier to communicate and to connect. It is not the same trust that you have in an in-person webinar that we have, but we have to take into consideration all these situations. Thank you, Dino, for your question. Thank you very much, Jorge. So I would like to take advantage. To this this intervention. And Betsaida, how are you? It's a pleasure to see you. I wanted to ask you about the presentation of these submissions. What is the challenge that you have identified with the petitions that you have received in according to the commercial trade with the United States and Panama, and how can those challenges for submission presentation be overcome? Thank you, Dino, for your question. I'm very well, thank you. What I can tell you within these 5 years, that the Secretariat of Panama has been operating is that the communities, in the majority directly, sometimes through NGOs, they have the interest of submitting communications, and they see that there are environmental situations that they should be responded to. But one of the challenges that I have found have to do with overcoming the superiority. And sometimes you find communities or groups that say that they have submitted complaints, but these are complaints made on the radio, on public meetings and social media, but not in informal procedures or in written procedures that they can be provided to the Secretariat. Documents that have been submitted formally to the government, that non-compliance situation is being carried out. So that's a first step. Sometimes we find social networks where community leaders or representatives were exchanging with ministers or with the regional representatives. So they felt that their complaint was being responded to. However, if it was not formal, they cannot reach the communication process that something in writing that will formalize it. And the other challenge was the issue of identifying environmental laws which have been affected, that it has not been enforced. The people from the community do perceive the situation, but when they talk about the legislation that they say is not being responded to, maybe they can give you a framework, but the specific topic is limited. In fact, I took note as part of the observations that Joanna made regarding developing materials for communication for sectors, for different sectors, because part of what we have done from the Secretariat in communication is to communicate the law in force so that the public can have that option before of looking or researching before. And we have a website in our Secretariat where it says, where we have a section, know your environmental laws, and that way they can enrich their communication and sometimes enrich the submission that they will be making to the government. So that is what I can share in the case of Panama. Thank you, Besaida. And related to what you just mentioned, Betsaida, and in fact, something that the conversation today, what I mentioned in the beginning, but also some panelists. The idea is that this process is relatively simple, that the requirements that have to be met by a petitioner are easy to comply with. In practice, it hasn't always been the case. In practice, we see that some of the petitioners have difficulty in complying certain requirements. And I want to ask David. David, good morning. Thank you for being here with us. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the strategies that have been developed from the Secretariat of Colombia in order to respond to some difficulties that could be faced by the the petitioners? And please take into consideration the interpreters speak a little bit slower so that they can do their work. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dino, for your question and for moderating this meeting. On our behalf, we have tried to facilitate the compliance and the requirements that are demanded in the agreement, in the trade agreement, in the environmental chapter. And it's very similar in all the different secretariats. So for that, we have given the option of submitting these petitions physically as well as virtual, either through electronic mail, but also in our website, we have a portal or a website in order to submit these petitions. And it's a step by step. And what we're looking for is to facilitate. And we are trying to comply with the requirements and identify what is the information that should be submitted, the possibility of providing support, of downloading files, of protecting the progress of the submission in order to be able to review it with the representatives before it's submitted. And in addition, on the option also of receiving in this email. So on one hand, it's not necessary to submit it physically, but we have those other means like place. And also we had, remember that we had issues with submitting the petitions in person. So please, if you can submit in, we have developed in our social networks, photographs, videos, and also a strategy that we have taken from CAFTA DR is to have these alliances with universities, with legal agencies, in order to have these third parties which are independent that could provide advice to the interested parties in submitting a petition in order to comply with these requirements. And this is because it's very common in the region that people do not know their environmental standards. And these clinics, these legal attorney or these attorneys' offices that are specialized in the environment can provide information to the people and tell them what are the standards, or to gather the support for the case. And the consultants can help in prepare the submission, or that maybe the university can prepare the application on behalf of these petitioners. These are some of the examples. In addition, I think that it's worthwhile to mention that the possibility of using examples from the other secretariats in the region, so that the potential petitioners, if they have similar situations, we are sharing constantly with other secretariats these submissions that could be a reference for people. And we have been talking in these days how we have seen similar problems in the secretariats and how they were duplicated in the region. These are some of the considerations. Once again, thank you, Dino, for being in this activity or participating in this activity. Thank you, David, and thank you for sharing with us. Since I still have some questions, I would like to ask you to please very brief. I have a question for Paolo Solano. Paolo, we have been talking about the perspective of the civil association, the perspective of the government, the perspective of the submitters or the petitioners. But what is your perspective from this perspective? What is your perspective from the Secretariat's point of view? With the changes that we have had in recent years with the enforcement of the TMIC or the USMA, the terms have also changed to respond to the submissions, and also periods of time where we didn't know that existed for certain parties at the submission, for the submissions. How are you seeing these terms? The terms, what is the perspective of the Secretariat, but also for the process, for implementing the process of the submissions? Definitely, the topic of the deadlines is an Achilles heel. For us, it implies to focus all the resources when we receive a submission. We have 30 work days to present a submission, and then also determine if it merits a response. And the petitioner wants a very fast response. But on this side, we have to focus and to start drafting and preparing before making the analysis of the petition to draft the, we have to do it in 2 of the 3 official languages of the CEC, Commission for Environmental Cooperation. The initial phases of the mechanism, which is receiving the submission to see if we can admit it and then determine a response. We had done it within the 30 days. Before, we had 60 work days, and it was practically 3 months. But now with the 30 days, it's hard, it's difficult, but we have been within time. Where we have had more difficulty, and it implies more investment of time and to focus resources, is when we decide to have the factual records. Before, we had 120 workdays, more than enough time to do this in 3 languages. But now we only have 60 days, 60 workdays, or 2 months to have this notification, this determination. In general terms, we have complied, or we have met the times. Sometimes in an isolated manner, sometimes it takes maybe a week more or 10 days more, but we have been trying to meet the deadlines. The USMAC mechanism, when they didn't establish times or phases, is in the voting of the board, and that is where we're having problems. We have to pay more attention in the fact that the board gives its instructions, gives us a reasonable deadline. The parties do not have the corresponding times for this new government and to make the decision, because for a petitioner, it is important to hear a deadline that doesn't exceed the 6 months. When this decision is made, or when it takes 9 months, 1 year, or more than a year, then it has problems with the mechanism. So something that we have been saying or talking with the parties, with the board of the CEC, we hope to have agreements and more timely decisions. Undoubtedly, I think that having mechanism times and that improves the reliability of the mechanism and the credibility of the mechanism, that it works in a timely manner when we have this situation. Thank you very much, Dino, and very happy to participate with all my colleagues. Thank you very much, Paolo. And I have one last consult for the room. It's for Marta. I had the strategy of leaving you at the end, so that you could notice my that I prefer the Secretariat of Peru. I have a question related to very interesting requests that have been received at the Secretariat of Peru in recent months. And these are very interesting when I read them, and any people in knowing this mechanism that can review them, they're on the website. Do you feel that there are obstacles? Have you faced any specific challenge in requesting the submissions, in processing the submissions? Thank you very much, Dino. First, publicly, I would like to thank you for continuing with this group of directors, and specifically and personally for giving me support in taking this position in the Secretariat with dedication, and for the many questions that I have been asking you. And with the recent submissions that we have received in this year that I have been in charge of the Secretariat, The problem was that one of the petitioners submitted their request with regarding project, a bill of law regarding the scope of environmental law. And we understand very clearly that that petitioner understood and at, in about a month, he submitted another petition, but it was an effective standard which was already approved. And a second topic, which is a topic which is critical, and it refers to the topic of confidentiality. Confidentiality in our country, as you know, is regulated according to the rules established with the understanding for the creation of the Secretariat. In Peru, we don't have a specific procedure that establishes beyond what is established in the treaty, details on how to implement the mechanism. So we are guided by what is in the understanding. And the understanding says that confidentiality with regards to the public. So initially, we received a petition where 7 people wanted confidentiality, and they had as a reference what was mentioned in the understanding. And the Secretariat accepted this confidentiality. But a few days later, we had the board meeting, and I informed the board that this request of confidentiality included, and the board to date, recently now in April, has made the decision in the sense of interpreting that confidentiality applies only in the case of Peru with regards to the public, but the public doesn't include the authorities, with which I have to communicate with the petitioners. And of the 7 petitioners, 7 of them have desisted personally of their requests. I have informed the board of the 5 people who accepted that their personal information be submitted to the board of both countries. But this is a challenge because we consider specifically with, or personally, we consider that the interpretation of the applicable laws of the implementation of the mechanism, then we have to look at principles. We have to look at the objective, the effective implementation, compliance, effective implementation of environmental law. And in the treaty, in the preamble, there are arguments of sustainable development. But we as a secretariat comply with informing the petitioners on the decisions of the board. This is one of the great challenges that we have had, and I have shared at the meetings that we had with other directors. Thank you once again, Dino. Marta, thank you. Thank you for all the ideas that you have shared with us. Unfortunately, as it always happens with very interesting discussions, time flies, and this is no exception. We had more questions. We had more questions for the panelists, but unfortunately, we are out of time, and we want to be very respectful of the final time. We already went over a few minutes. So thank you on my behalf, and I pass the microphone to Mario so he can say a few closing remarks. Thank you very much, Dino. Yes, this event has been very enriching. We would like to thank the directors and the secretaries and our special guests, people who have been with us this morning in line, and especially to the panelists, Dino, Pablo, Sandra, Alejandra, Johanna. We are very grateful. We have very important notes of what you have shared with us. All the topics are very enriching. Some of them connect with the, we have to think with our field teams. And I think that it would be very appreciated what you have shared with us today. Without further ado, we are going to conclude this event. Thank you for your patience, time, and participation. Have a nice afternoon.